Hello, History 363. So today I think it would be worth actually just hunkering down and talking about the origin stories that the Romans tell about themselves. These are civic myths. One thing I want to be careful about is not suggesting that we should see these stories as in really any way historical. It's possible these stories may here and there contain what sort of mythographers like to optimistically call a kernel of truth, but really we don't necessarily know even what that kernel might be. So in some ways, when we talk about the origin stories of Rome, we're really talking about the ways in which later Romans think about their early history. And the Romans, interestingly enough, have really not just one origin story, which is pretty standard, but two. One is unquestionably a native origin story, and that's the story of Romulus and Remus. The other is an external story, a broader Mediterranean story that ties in with the corpus of Greek myth. And it seems that at a certain point, the Romans use these two stories to both sort of explain themselves to themselves with Romulus and Remus, a myth that is deeply embedded in the actual topography of Rome itself and Latium more broadly. And then also, probably because of their interactions with the wider world, particularly probably with the Greeks, who again are not just in Greece but are in southern Italy and Sicily, accepted an origin story that tied them in with the sort of Homeric tradition of the aftermath of the Trojan War. So there's two origin stories. They eventually become kind of crudely integrated because at some point the dissonance doesn't quite work out. But the fact that they have to be kind of crudely integrated stems from the fact that there are these two stories sort of circulating simultaneously to begin with. So let's start with the first story, Romulus and Remus. So this story suggests that there are two brothers. They are from the royal house, royal maybe in quotation marks, of Alba Longa. Now, Alba Longa is a place in Latium. It's not a city-state, but rather it's a festival site, a sort of area, fairground almost, where all of the Latin communities, including Rome, come together once a year to celebrate the Latin festival. So Romulus and Remus are said to stem from this site, and it's the Alba Mons is in fact a very high recognizable central point on the plains of Latium. That's probably why everyone comes together there at that particular point for the festival. But they're from a place that is of substantial religious and ritual importance for the broader Latin community. So supposedly they're from Alba Longa. Their father is a good king named Numitor, who is overthrown by his evil brother Amulius. They themselves are born of a Vestal virgin. Their mother, Ria Silvia, is a Vestal virgin, which is priestesses, aristocratic priestesses who serve the hearth goddess Vesta. And during the time of their service, which runs from when they're just about to hit puberty into middle age, they are required to maintain their chastity. Once they leave service, they actually are allowed to marry. But during the time as Vestal virgins, they can actually be killed by burial, being buried alive, if they violate their chastity. So supposedly, Ria Silvia, a Vestal virgin, so not supposed to be marrying and having children, is lying by the river when the war god Mars comes along, sees her, and rapes her. And through this intercourse, coerced in most versions of the myth, Romulus and Remus are conceived, which means they are therefore the sons of not just any random god, but the sons of the war god. Clearly tells you something about how the Romans think of themselves as inherently martial, inherently warlike. Now, Ria Silvia, there's kind of vague stories of what happens to her. It seems that she is imprisoned when this sort of is discovered, and may have some kind of vaguely happy ending where she's at the end of it sort of marries a river god. But because it's obviously quite bad for her to be pregnant, and also because of the sort of coup that's taken place in Alba Longa, the story goes that she decides to put Romulus and Remus in a basket and float them on the Tiber River. And of course, you might actually think, well, wait a second, I can think of somebody else who is put in a basket and floated down a river, Moses in the Bible. And again, this is a kind of meme, a sort of mythic meme that is sort of floating around the Mediterranean. So it's probably not a coincidence. We have a very similar story told about Romulus and Remus, and a very similar story told about Moses. And remember, there's this huge kind of Phoenician diaspora that might actually bring us a story from the Levant and deposit it in the central Mediterranean. You can actually see where that meme, how it might potentially move around the Mediterranean. So Romulus and Remus float down the Tiber, they wash ashore, and of course they're babies. This should be a death sentence, but they are rescued by a she-wolf, a lupa, who therefore nurses them. And indeed the cave where they are nursed on the Capitoline is called the Lupercal Cave. And on one hand, the wolf is probably totemic. We do know that there are various animal totems assigned to various Italian peoples, and so the story may in part originate from a kind of totemic importance of the wolf in early Rome. And of course, the idea is that they are somehow kind of primal. They have this sort of an inherent animal strength to them. They grow up to be fine, strapping young men. They go back to Alba Longa. They right this coup. They kick out their evil uncle and reinstall their grandfather. But then Romulus and Remus say, well, we're now fine young strapping men. We need our own city. And they decide to go and found a city in the place where they had washed ashore on the Tiber, which of course happens to be Rome. So the story goes, they go, they set up their city, and then in some dispute, Romulus kills Remus. In the kind of canonical version of the dispute, it's a dispute over augury, how to read the signs of birds. Therefore they each sort of see a different sign. Remus sees 6 birds first, but then Romulus sees 12 birds, and that's more. 12 being the number of lictors carrying fasces, the symbols of authority that a consul has. And in that story, that's why Romulus kills Remus. There's another kind of more obscure version that Romulus builds a wall, Remus somehow jumps over it, violating the integrity of the wall, and then for that reason, Romulus kills Remus. Again, if we're thinking of little memes ricocheting around the Mediterranean, you might again think to the Hebrew Bible and the story of Cain and Abel and 2 brothers who murder each other for kind of obscure reasons. It's not impossible, again, that we have that little meme bouncing around and it's influenced the story of Romulus and Remus. So Remus is dead. Romulus therefore becomes the first king of Rome, according to the Romans, the first of 7 legendary kings. And his plan to populate Rome is actually, I think, interesting and important. So supposedly he sets up an asylum on the Capitoline Hill and allows anyone who wants to join this new Roman community, because he actually needs people for his city, to come. This supposedly includes, brigands, runaway slaves, kind of all this sort of scum of the earth types. They can go. They're sort of whatever tawdry past they have will be forgiven, and they can have a new life in Rome. Now, I say this is important because the Romans do not believe in their inherent myth that they are autochthonous. And this is most, for example, not all, but many Greek peoples tell myths that emphasize how they are autochthonous, that is, sprung literally from the soil of that area. And in springing from the soil, they therefore deserve to be there. So the Thebans believe that they are sprung from the dragon's teeth sown by Cadmus. The Athenians likewise believe that they are autochthonous to Attica itself, and they're not immigrants from some other place. So while many Greek communities, not all, but again, emphasize their autochthony from somewhere else, from kind of all over Italy, where they then are able to become citizens anew and afresh in this city. And I think as we look forward, one thing that does distinguish Rome quite markedly as a city-state is the willingness of the Romans to extend citizenship and extend the right of civic participation to peoples beyond the initial Roman population, including peoples who usually they've defeated in warfare. And that is, on one hand, going to help make Rome such a militarily powerful and dynamic state. But it's possible that they're even willing to do that because they've developed a origin story, and there's then the ideological ramifications of that. Anyone can be Roman, just as the initial citizens of Rome weren't sprung from the soil, don't inherently belong there, but rather were people who had all immigrated in and been sort of naturalized by Romulus, who also comes from somewhere else. So that is the story of Romulus and Remus. Of course, we'll talk more when we talk about the legends of the kings of Rome about some of the other things that Romulus does. Again, that is a very, when I say it's a native origin story, it is, Romulus and Remus, they own topography in Rome, mythic topography. Now, you can walk by the Capitoline Hill and say, that is the Lupercal Cave, where the wolf nursed Romulus and Remus. You can point to all along and say, that is where Romulus and Remus came from. And obviously it's still an important ritual site. So the story is actually embedded in the actual topography. Not so with the other story that the Romans tell. Again, the external story. And that is the story of Aeneas. So the story is Aeneas is a Trojan warrior. Already Homer is aware that while many of the Trojan warriors are going to meet a terrible fate at the end of the war, Paris is going to die, King Priam is going to die. But Homer already in the 8th century is aware that Aeneas will escape, that Aeneas is one of the Trojan warriors who survives the war. And a myth had developed that he had subsequently wandered with another of the with various Trojan survivors, and that they had gone on to found a community. And it seems that Greeks, probably as they engaged in their diaspora, had come to believe that he had founded some community in central Italy. We actually have a very old terracotta from central Italy that shows Aeneas carrying his elderly father Anchises. Anchises had been his father had slept, had sexual relations with Aphrodite or Venus, and had subsequently been crippled either simply because those relations are too powerful and overwhelm him, or there's also the story in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite that he brags about it, and that's what gets him sort of punished by the gods with being such a paraplegic. But anyway, the legend that subsequently will become very much part of this Roman origin story is that Aeneas had fled from Troy as it was being sacked, with his father Anchises on his shoulder, carrying his son Ascanius by the hand, and also carrying the household gods of Troy. And indeed, this is the embodiment of Roman piety in Virgil's Aeneid, written after the Republican period is over. Aeneas is routinely called pious Aeneas, because he takes care of his family responsibilities, his responsibility to his elderly father, his responsibility as a father himself to his son, and then his religious responsibilities to the gods. And he does those responsibilities even under the extreme duress of the Trojan War. And so wanders and then sets up shop in Italy. Now, again, the Romans were already kind of aware of, these two stories don't really work out. The way that they sort of eventually reconciled them was that Aeneas had come, that he had established a community of Trojans and their sort of Italian wives at Lanuvium, and then subsequently his descendants had gone on to found Alba Longa. Their descendants had been Romulus and Remus, and so Aeneas is kind of a great grandfather to Romulus and Remus. So he's in the genealogy, but that was the way that the Romans reconcile these two stories, the external story and the sort of native story, that of course otherwise wouldn't be, aren't really reconcilable. Now, there's a big advantage in having Aeneas as a founder in some way or another of Rome or the Roman line. And that is, it allows the Romans from a very early date, and again, the Terracotta suggests that the story is circulating in around the 5th century BC. Our earliest evidence that we have for the Romulus and Remus story that we can kind of confirm with physical evidence is a coin from 269, which actually shows the she-wolf suckling the twins. So at least from the 3rd century, we know that this story is being mobilized as a symbol of Roman nationalism, the Romulus and Remus story. There is a report in Livy that a statue of the wolf suckling the twins is installed in 293. And if that date is accurate, it would again suggest that the early 3rd century is a time when that story, it isn't necessarily being invented, but is really being mobilized in a serious way to think about Roman identity. Now, the advantage, though, of the Aeneas story, which also is probably being mobilized in some instances simultaneously, is that it allows them to have not just sort of cultural interactions with the Greeks, but diplomatic interactions with various Greek and also Hellenized communities. A key aspect of Greek diplomacy in particular is what modern historians call kinship diplomacy. That is, if there is another community that you want to work out some kind of arrangement with, whether it's military assistance or trade or some other form of cooperation, the diplomatic language that you use is the language of myth. You come up, even if you have to work very hard to do it, with some kind of distant connection between a Homeric hero associated with that community and a Homeric hero associated with your community. And again, the key thing is the fact that it doesn't really matter the connection. Indeed, the connections that sort of Greek diplomats come up with are oftentimes quite quirky and creative and vague. But what matters is that that this is the diplomatic language that you can speak. It matters more that you try to articulate your relationship using the myth. And in some ways that shows everybody, hey, we're all on the same page, we're all speaking the same diplomatic idiom, we're all culturally similar. So if you can actually say, well, we're the Romans, we're strange in many ways, Latin, our language is Latin, but hey, let me tell you, we're not that strange because, we were founded by Aeneas as he fled from Troy, and then, whatever X or Y community can say, oh, yes, well, find some connection to the Trojan War, which, is always the goal of kinship diplomacy. And once you have that connection, now you're speaking the same diplomatic language, and you can go forward and talk about the maybe other more pragmatic things that you want to talk about, whatever your trade agreement is going to be, or your military treaty is going to be. Again, while the Romans have this kind of native myth, having this external myth allows them to tie in to the wider world. And indeed, in some ways, the fact that we have in Rome, at a pretty early point, the juggling of two myths, it is a sign of how Rome is, from an early point also, a power, even though it's still a city-state, that is already looking to much broader horizons than its own immediate topography. So anyway, those are some myths. We'll continue our discussion of early Rome. I'll see you soon.